So I have a dual role. So on one hand, I'm Chief Research Officer for the Disney Media and Advertising Lab, which is based in Austin, Texas, but I'm also continuing as an academic, and I run a research center called the Audience Research Labs at Murdoch University in Australia. Now, the Disney Lab is actually not a neuro vendor. We don't actually provide like neuro services per se. The Disney Lab philosophy is to have available all tools when we want to study and analyze audience behavior. And so in that way, we do rely on a range of neuro measures, but in actual fact, we're not really like a neuroscience provider to the marketplace, so to speak.
So let's start with Disney. I mean, obviously Disney has movies and television and all that stuff. So can you talk about some recent research projects you've done and kind of what tools you pulled in and what some of the findings were?
Sure. I think one of the largest studies that we've done in the past year was for ESPN, which of course is one of the Disney media networks. And during the World Cup, we did a lot of research looking at 3D television and both what the potential effects were, some potentially adverse like health effects, as well as what the potential impact was. Now, that was a massive study. It was 2,700 hours of testing, which occurred in the 1-month period during the World Cup. Quite extensive with a large range of measures. On the health effects side, for example, we gave people eye exams before and after the experience so we could see whether their stereopsis had shifted in any way. We did eye gaze for 3D, which was a huge breakthrough, trying to figure out just how to do that kind of research.
What does that mean, eye gaze?
Eye gaze is mapping eye movement on screen. So you basically want to map what people are looking at, where their eye is fixating on the screen. Now, there are methods for doing that, of course, for two-dimensional television. We had to work with some of the eye gaze vendors to develop new methods for being able to do that for 3D.
And were you successful in developing a way to
absolutely.
map it? Okay.
We went through 3 or 4 different iterations, and we had to actually develop our own custom software to be able to analyze the data. But given the volume of research that we do, of course, we had a lot of opportunity there to try to figure out how to do it. And by the end of the exercise, we had a very effective measure, which we continue to use for mapping eye movement on 3D.
Now, I'm assuming you compared maybe somebody watching a 2D feed to a 3D feed. Did you notice any differences in terms of where they focus their attention?
There was actually. A very good example that I might use to simplify this is one of the ads that we tested was in 3D, was for Toy Story. The Toy Story 3D kind of, it was perfect because you had both a 3D version and a 2D version. So some people saw a 2D version and some people saw a 3D version, and we compared those. And you see very different patterns of visual fixation. One of the most interesting for us was at the very beginning, you see the Disney with the castle in the background, kind of, presents, Disney Studios, Disney Pictures. Then you see the Pixar animation, which is very flat, white background, no depth. And the patterns, of course, in 2D and 3D were very similar for that. Whereas for the Disney, with the castle in the background, very high depth definition, you saw a very strong fixation on the word Disney, very different pattern. And then what happens is there's a third title that appears slightly after, which is Disney and Pixar, both together on the same graphic. And what you see there is almost all the eyes in 3D fixate on the word Disney, whereas in 2D they were fixating kind of equally between the Disney and the Pixar. So you see very, very different kind of patterns. The way that I would summarize it best is that with 2D, people tend to take a lot of information in at the periphery of their viewing, of their field of vision. With 3D, they tend to look very precisely at points. So you're actually getting a lot more precise kind of movement of the eye with 3D. And with 2D, you're getting a lot more look at the center of the action and kind of take in the activity in the periphery.
So in terms of developing ad creative for 3D television, what would be your recommendation to a creative agency?
Well, I don't know at this stage. I mean, what I've shared is the tip of an iceberg. What we learned in that project was that the patterns of visual fixation are very different for 3D versus 2D. Now, there's a lot of research that we're going to have to do to come up with a playbook for how to do 3D effectively. It's very early days. So I'm not comfortable really kind of saying, here are the top 10 things you should do yet. At this stage, we're really just trying to understand those differences. We're not really at a stage where we've articulated a set view on what we think the right way to do it would be.
So now that 3D is starting to be available, obviously on home televisions and things like that, is Disney jumping in kind of feet first in the same way that I feel like networks sort of jumped into and embraced HD, or is there sort of more of a reservation?
Well, what I'm proud about with ESPN is that it hasn't jumped in the dark or in the blind on anything. I mean, there's a huge amount of research that has informed the decisions which ESPN has made. In particular, of course, there was a lot of concern around the potential adverse effects associated with potential health effects. And we did a lot of research on that question specifically in the lab. And what was fascinating was two things. One, there are problems that people attribute to 3D, which were equally present with 2D. So I'll give you an example, fatigue. People think that 3D perhaps contributes to fatigue. And it's true, it does. Over the course of watching, a 3-hour soccer match, people have much more visual fatigue at the end of that experience. But that was equally present when people watched it in 2D. But the most fascinating thing that we discovered in that particular study was we measured the same people coming in every day and watching a game in 3D. So that's like a 3-hour kind of viewing experience every day for 5 days in a row. And what we found was that the adverse health effects that we measured on day 1 had largely diminished by day 5. And so it's kind of similar to the effect that you have when you first put on glasses. And you have a little bit of an acclimation period that you go through. But a lot of those adverse health effects, primarily associated with headaches and visual eye strain, those problems really diminish significantly over that 5-day period. So again, one can never know what the effects are for every subsection of the population. That requires an enormous amount of continued research looking at the effects on small segments of the population, but in aggregate, we were very comfortable and convinced that the effects were not really as adverse as many people in the market were fearing it might be.
And obviously it's more expensive to produce the World Cup in 3D than 2D, or the NBA Finals in 3D than 2D. So do you see ESPN accelerating the pace of 3D adoption, slowing it down because the market's not there, or somewhere in between?
Well, ESPN's loyalty is fundamentally to the sports fan. And its mission is really to deliver to that constituency, above all. Very clearly, if that constituency welcomes, wants, is eager to see 3D, it's ESPN's mission to deliver. ESPN has been outstanding historically in being able to deliver, the right technology to those consumers when they demand it. Now, what our research has showed, not only for the World Cup, but continued research that we've done since then on football, on basketball, what we consistently show is that 3D content in sports, at least, is more engaging, it's more enjoyable for the audience, and most important, the viewers have a much higher sense of presence, the feeling of actually being there. And we found exactly the same thing across every one of the 3D studies that we've done to date. So we can conclude that for the audience, we are providing a superior viewing experience. And at the end of the day, that's what's most important and most critical.
And on the ad side, is enough ad inventory there that when you do a 3D production of an NFL game, that enough brands have created content to tap into that medium?
Well, I mean, clearly there's not what you would call a huge inventory of 3D advertising, and that's a problem for us from a research point of view. So for example, during the World Cup, the research findings were absolutely clear. 3D ads were vastly superior to 2D, and that was across a wide range of measures. But of course, the inventory is very limited, and also we're really not talking about like a clutter model. It's very, very, very limited interruption when there's only a few ads that are available. So it's very difficult to tease out the extent to which the effects that we see are really associated with some novelty around the 3D experience, or whether or not those effects are really enduring and will apply for lots of brands. And unfortunately, there's no shortcut to that, because we really have to have the ad inventory before we get a better feel for what that's going to look like going into the future.
So with the World Cup and the ads that were produced in 3D, can you give me an example of one that left an impression on you? I mean, this ad from this company.
Sure. So Gillette, for example, has an ad during the World Cup, ran an ad for a shaver, for a razor. And again, very simple. We're not talking about anything hugely complex, but just seeing the razor rotate around and there's something about that experience in 3D which is very, very different than the experience in 2D. I mean, 2D animation looks good. It's not that it looks bad. I mean, if you saw that commercial on television, you wouldn't think twice about it. But there's something about the experience in 3D which is special, which really kind of stands out. Now again, a lot of that may be novelty. It may be that in time there's nothing big about watching anything in 3D. But at this stage, the novelty of that experience clearly has an effect. And that's a positive.
So did you do any consumer research around that ad, and what did you find? I mean, did you have focus groups and eye tracking?
Well, we did do research around the ads during the World Cup. I can't talk about the findings for an individual advertiser, but I can say that the results, again, we found that across a wide range of metrics, everything from memory metrics, recall, recognition, etc., we saw huge boosts, 3D versus 2D. Ditto purchase intention, ditto ad liking, which is really interesting because you usually don't see, remember it's the same ad, the creative is not any different. So you usually don't see likability of the ad go up, but we actually saw that in this case. And of course the brand metrics as well in terms of the attitude towards the brand. So across the board, really we saw very significant positive effects for the brands. So my plenary presentation is going to be on new ad models, particularly, of course, with a research focus. I think no matter where you are in the value chain, a fundamental reality of the world that we live in today is this idea of accelerated change, perpetual change. The pace of change in our industry, in terms of the business side of our industry, was really, really quite slow historically. I mean, one major innovation a decade. And we're now at a stage where within a given year we have many innovations that are occurring. From a research point of view, I think we need to understand what the implications are. And that is that when tomorrow looks like yesterday, that favors certain research methods. But when tomorrow looks nothing like yesterday, then the question is, what are the research tools that we need to help guide us in planning for tomorrow, when very clearly, we're talking about guiding us into uncharted terrain. So how do we go about doing that? So the types of methods I think that were effective in the past, like analytics, like focus groups, etc., a lot of that was very good because we had such strong benchmarks. We had benchmarks either in our data. So even though the data that we might have in surveys may not accurately depict what was happening, they were proxies for what was happening. And we developed a little bit of a sense of the adjustment that we required to kind of track that momentum and see what that might translate to, like in actual sales behavior, etc. And the same with focus groups. With focus groups, we knew so much about our industry that when people made comments, we were able to extrapolate from those comments the right insights to be able to kind of guide us going into the future. Well, I think in both of those cases, really, the fact that tomorrow doesn't look like yesterday poses such a huge challenge. Now, the types of methods I think that we're seeing going into the future, I would put in two camps. One is tools that are helping us get a much better fix for actual usage behavior. This includes single source measurement, this includes set-top box data, this includes some really neat in-field kind of experiments that are happening, measuring behavior in home, cross-media, understanding how you make apples to apples kind of comparisons across those media platforms. We have fantastic work that's happening in all of those areas, trying to get a much better fix on the analytics associated with the change. So I put that on one side, and I think that's great. But meanwhile, there's another area, and that is really looking at the effects of variables. Now, the reason is because people are going to be in a constant pattern of change. So the idea of segmenting the audience, I think, is really yesterday. Now, instead of talking about audience segments, what we have to do is we have to understand the variables which shape behavior. Because people are actually going to be many different audience segments in one. In their average day, they're going to go through different kinds of behavior depending on their need states. So what we really need to understand is the influence of variables and how those variables interact with one another. And in that area, I think we have a lot of new tools that are coming to task. Those include a lot of the new neuromeasures, EEG, fMRI, biometrics, facial coding. What's really powerful about a lot of these new tools is they help us understand a lot about the emotional dimension of the experience as well. The other thing that I think we're seeing a lot of is labs. So we see lots of advertisers, lots of networks are now building their own labs our Disney lab is an example of that. And what the lab environment allows us to do is to isolate variables so that we can actually tease out what the effect of those variables are, to understand their influence and make decisions not so much just based on audience segments, but more importantly, based on those variables and how those variables interact within their contexts. And so I think that in both arenas, whether we're talking about the analytics or whether we're talking about this focus on variables, we're really experiencing some major breakthroughs in terms of new ways to approach our research. And I think that's absolutely critical if we're trying to understand perpetual change. Well, let me just go back one step and give you a little bit of an example of why that concept of variable is so important. A lot of the science that we've practiced in our media industries, I think until now, we're really based much more on the science of, Aristotle. And the science of Aristotle was very much about analytical observation. You look at the world, you see many things that are happening, and you categorize them into buckets. So you take observations and you try to basically segment them, and that's what I was talking about with segmentation. So we talk about different kinds of segments within the audience and how they behave. Now, Galileo challenged that model of science. And the model of science that Galileo brought was one which was now based on scientific method, and it was based on understanding the influence of variables. So now, instead of talking about just how you put things and classifying them in buckets, now you study a variable over and over again to understand all its nuances, how it interacts. So he would put, balls on planes, change the surface of the plane, change the angle, change the weight, do all these manipulations of those variables to understand their influence. In the same way, what we need to do in the media space is, rather than talk about just audience segments, we need to understand people's need states, the things that are driving behavior, and understand those variables and how they change throughout the course of people's experience. So that's what we try to do in the lab. Now, a lot of our lab research often focuses on individual models, new models that are coming to the fore. And what we want to understand is we want to understand how those models will perform in the real world before we deploy them, or as they're being deployed, we want to understand how effective they are. So, for example, sometimes the news is good news. One area where we've seen a lot of really exciting news is in the whole online media player space. There is something about the online experience, particularly, I think, largely due to the limited interruption. So the fact that you don't have to watch a whole large body of ads, but you're watching a few ads.
So just to be clear, we're specifically talking about online video right now.
Online video, yeah. So the online video experience. And particularly there's opportunity to interact with a lot of those ads. We've done a lot of research which shows that that interaction is actually more effective. So you have this environment which is very positive, and we're doing a lot of research to understand those nuances. Then there are other models that come along. One example, using my university affiliation that I can tell you about, we have this project called Beyond 30 Seconds. Beyond 30 Seconds has now been running for 7 years. We're approaching $9 million in funding for it now. We've done over 10,000 testing sessions. It's a large body of research. And in those, we've tested a lot of new models. So one of the models that wasn't very effective, for example, is the idea of what's called speed bumps, which is as you fast forward through an ad, having a banner that's superimposed over that ad. And we find that in actual fact, that doesn't do anything in terms of your capacity to better recall that ad later. There's no difference really between the fast-forwarded ad and the fast-forwarded ad with a banner on top of it. So that's an example. So we're constantly testing new ad models, new opportunities to try to understand how they might perform. Well, so Beyond 30 Seconds is a project that, as I say, is now in its 7th year. We've completed 42 studies to date. That's over 5,000 pages of reports. It's like the encyclopedia of new ad models. It's a huge body of research. What's really nice about the project is it's a very good example of how industry-academic collaboration can work. There's a community of about 30 sponsors for the project. Many of the leading networks, leading brands, and technology enablers all coming together. The industry partners decide on the research agenda for every year. So we have an annual conference. Everybody floats topics for research priorities. That's voted on, and every year we pick 6 studies which are going to be the focus for that year. The academic team then puts and applies the rigor of academic research to those 6 studies and studies those topics and delivers the reports and the findings back to the industry partners. So a very good example, I think, of how industry and academic collaboration can work effectively.
And can you just quickly list who some of the industry partners are and who some of the academics are?
Well, so the academic team is really my research team in Australia, although the data is collected at the Disney Lab at the CBS Television City facility. So I mean, the data is collected in the United States. But on the network side, they include, you know, ABC, NBC, CBS, MTV networks, et cetera. So a lot of the main networks, cable, like with Comcast, Verizon, a lot of technology enablers like, you know, Microsoft, OpenTV, et cetera. And then, of course, a lot of the leading advertising brands like, you know, Best Buy, Coca-Cola, GM, P&G, you know. So it's a great community, like I said, of about 30 industry partners who collaborate together in defining the research agenda for each, you know, for each year.
So what's the research agenda for this year? What are you focused on?
The research priorities that we're looking at this year, connected TV is big, online media players are big, mobile's big. We continue to look at addressability. We've done lots of studies looking at all the different nuances around addressability.